1990, just 2 years after its predecessor launch, it was time for something different. A time window when the consumers and businesses were bombarded with various architectures, system designs, RISC, CISC. Everyone who was in the computing business made big claims and was fighting to get a hold of decent market share. The dominant architecture by a landslide was x86. At this stage, some of the competitors found it tough to get a stronghold. But what about Microsoft, who had put 2 iterations of its flagship operating system, introducing Windows 3.x, the successor to Windows 2. This was a major departure from its previous iterations. Now we had clickable icons instead of a list with names. It heavily relied on more efficient resource management, distributing resources evenly, and prioritizing workloads. While Windows 2.0 was technically the next iteration, it didn't look the part. The changes were under the hood, sure, but not in the UI. Still a list-based operating system UI. Right before the 2 release, Intel was coming with 80286 and later it introduced 80386. As popular as previous processors 8086 and 8088 were, they couldn't multitask. But Intel went all in with these new processors. There were significant upgrades and introduced some game-changing features such as memory protection, hardware task switching, virtual memory, and program privilege separation. You can also think of it as compartmentalization. As this wasn't enough, it added support up to 16 times the memory of the previous processors. Now, the high-end market was rocking 80286 and 386, while mid to low-end got 8086 and 88. Windows called them protected mode and real mode. Windows 2 started this trend and it continued with Windows 3. But it was really obvious that Microsoft wanted to push Windows 3.x as a high-end product. From the start, Windows ran on MS-DOS as a shell program, meaning the code was still DOS, but you had a UI to interact with. With Windows 3, senior executives wanted to move away from the list-based navigation and introduced icons and drop-down menus. In addition, they also started pushing Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. They were introduced in Windows 2, but it was time for them to take off and really tie the whole OS together. Before we get to the new design element changes, new processors came with an instruction set, MMX or multimedia instruction. This instruction set is still in use to this day, and it allows different peripherals such as joysticks, mice, CD-ROMs, graphic cards, audio cards, stuff like that to be connected to the computer, which were becoming more common than ever. There was a trend that started with Windows 1. The system requirements were always above average, to a point where some users called it extravagant. That stayed true with Windows 3. These are the minimum system requirements for 1, 2, and 3. You can see that with every iteration, the RAM doubled to support the operating system. While there was definitely some truth to the specs complaint, running GUI on top of the DOS definitely took its toll. In addition to the quality of life changes and under-the-hood improvements, dynamic data exchange was reintroduced, a protocol introduced back in Windows 2 where the different resource objects could be shared for optimizing performance. However, memory restraints made it borderline impossible to use. Taking advantage of the increased memory in the new OS worked. Okay, so there is something that we should know. The reason why Windows is a household name and why it was able to rise above the competition. When Microsoft introduced MS-DOS, they were starting out and were looking for investors and potential partners. IBM, which was a giant in the industry in the late 70s, approached Microsoft and wanted to sell their systems with MS-DOS running on top. This plan was working perfectly, and Microsoft got significant attention because of this partnership. Early 80s come around and Microsoft, inspired by the Park, the first GUI, introduced Windows 1, a shell program running on top of the DOS. Microsoft tried its best to convince IBM to incorporate Windows into its systems. IBM wasn't interested. Windows 2 came and IBM still refused to incorporate it into their systems. But they did want the functionality of Windows 2. You see, MS-DOS could only run one program at a time, but with new processors, protected mode was feasible. So they asked Microsoft to include protected mode functionality into the new iteration of MS-DOS. IBM insisted that they make a brand new OS, hence two companies developed an OS called OS2. A couple years after Windows 3 was introduced, executives at Microsoft focused on this OS and marketed productive apps, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. IBM wasn't happy with this move, and as a result, their relationship was damaged. Now, let's make some educated estimates and do some guesswork. IBM, how could you not see that Windows was on its way to revolutionize the industry? Sure, with Windows 1, it was mostly met with negative reviews, but Windows 2 and 3? You already had the partnership with Microsoft. You could have included Windows 2 in your systems. Okay, maybe you didn't know back then. What about Windows 3? You saw the critical praise and acclaim it received. Why didn't you include it then? They still insisted on developing something based on the systems and designs of the MS-DOS. You know, the outdated operating system. At this stage, Microsoft also starting seeing huge success, and the partnership with IBM must have felt like a side product. And who could blame them? Once a giant in the tech industry was not doing so well in the operating systems game. I think it was a huge oversight not to include Windows in their system or develop something based on Windows. The past two iterations saw a sort of incline in reception. Windows 1 was met with mixed reviews, 2 did the same except a lot more reviews were favorable, and in case of 3, it was a huge success. A vast majority of critics agreed that Microsoft should continue the direction it's taking. The days of command line interface were mostly behind us. With this entry, critics had to take it seriously with Microsoft's track record at that point. It was clear that Microsoft was implementing the feedback from the users and was serious about getting huge market shares. Up until Windows 3.x, you needed MS-DOS installed. After the DOS installation, you could install Windows. So if you're a retro and you want to experience it yourself, here's how to do it. First up, install MS-DOS in a virtual machine. After booting up the machine, add a floppy disk image of Windows, navigate into that directory, and then run setup.exe. After that, it's pretty self-explanatory. Just follow the setup wizard instructions and attach the second and third image file when prompted. To run it, however, just write win and voila. From the last entry, the MS-DOS executive has been changed to Program Manager, which is this window. Multiple windows overlapped each other, and here's the UI is really defined from the previous iterations. Within the Program Manager, we have some icons that can be thought of as groups of applications. They can be dragged around and arranged. We have the close button on the top left corner, minimize and maximize at the top right corner. Dragging windows around, it is obvious that there is little to no implementation of the hardware graphics acceleration. The mouse movement does feel a lot better than the previous entries, but it's still nowhere near what I would call usable. DPI movements have gotten comparatively better. Drop-down menu is here and we can choose from a couple of options. All the previous programs are here with some new additions such as MS Editor and Games. So, that was an incredible ride. And the obvious question is it usable nowadays? As a notepad, calculator, old games, and maybe a nostalgia dose? Aside from those, not really, but this OS was a big deal. It finalized the core UI that is still in use in Windows to this day. I believe in a way it gave Windows its own identity and something recognizable. At this stage, Microsoft held a significant proportion of users and they had taken the right direction. That culminated into Windows 95, the operating system that defined the rest of the iterations. But that's a story for another day which you don't want to miss. With that being said, this is Rokat. I hope you guys enjoyed this perspective. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you guys later.